My aim this morning is to get out of the way so that you can hear this clear instruction. The first and foundational step of faith must be obedience to God's clear call and command. The first and foundational step of faith must be in obedience to God's clear call and command. And when we get out of this place, when we leave the church this morning, I want you to be thinking carefully, thinking clearly, committing yourself to the fact that God is calling you to something. There's a clear call on your life. There's a clear command on your life. What is that for me? What is God saying? This is your next step. Because I put in brackets underneath here, what expectation should we have when God gives direction and we fail to follow him? Like, what is your expectation of that? I ask this to my kids sometimes. When I give you an instruction and you just ignore me, how do you think I'm going to respond to that? What do you think that does to our relationship? Parents, maybe you can identify with this. Having kids who don't listen can be an intensely frustrating experience. Just get up and do the dishes. I don't want to sit here and stand for hours, do the dishes, do the dishes, do the dishes, do the dishes. For some of us parents, we don't even bother to ask anymore because we're so tired of asking, it's just easier to do it ourselves. That's not good parenting, by the way. Some hills are worth dying on, some battles are worth fighting. Sometimes the easiest path is not the best path. But I think it's worth asking the question, what's our expectation when God gives us clear direction and we just don't follow it? The first and foundational step of faith must be obedience to God's clear call and command. Let me read for you Judges chapter 4. I'm going to read only about halfway through the first chapter, Judges 4. I'm going to read from verse 1 to verse 16. Let's hear the word of the Lord together. After Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. And she said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops, to the Kishon River, and I will give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I won't go." "Very well," Deborah said, "I will go with you. But because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and he pitched his tents by the great tree in Zanaim, near Kadesh. Zananim, not Zanaim, Zananim. If you ever wanted to find your way there, you would have no idea because I pronounced it wrong, right? Near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered together his 900 iron chariots and all the men with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and his army by the sword. And Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim. And all the troops of Sisera fell by the sword, and not a man was left. This is the word of the Lord, and we thank God for his word. God, once again, delivers his people. Did you see the same pattern? We should be getting familiar with this. There's a judge. It says that after he had died, so there was a judge who delivered God's people and led them well. And things are relatively well with the land, and in the land, and with the people. But, once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Once again, they leave the God who, remember, ransomed them from their slavery, the God who heard their cries in Egypt, the God who delivered them, the God who called them by name, the God who promised himself to them and said, here's what it means to be my people. The God who has already been good to Israel is now forgotten by the people who he loved once again. And so the cycle begins once again. God gives them over to the nations. He gives them over to the oppressors. It's interesting, the city of Hazor, which is where Jabin the king lives, Joshua actually burned the city of Hazor. It was put to the flame. And again, one of the interesting things about these old stories we have is the archaeological evidence is fascinating. If you go to the old city of Hazor, we can actually see a layer where the city was clearly burned to the ground. Joshua had done this a number of generations ago. So you say, well, why would these kings want to go live in a burned out settlement? The city of Hazor was so beautifully strategically located that Joshua conquers it, but they don't drive the people out. And so the people reassemble. And what we find is they bring with them these iron chariots. Now, to you and I, iron chariots may not sound all that impressive, but tell you what, we'll find an old iron chariot, we'll have horses attached to it, and we'll give you a stick in your hand, and we'll have someone ride that iron chariot towards you with you and your stick, and see how you like fighting people from the ground on your feet against those iron chariots. This is new military technology. This is cutting edge military technology. This is the ancient equivalent of a drone strike. Okay? That's what we're dealing with here. Now, it's interesting, they have this military power, and we can understand from a military standpoint why they're oppressing and how they're oppressing the Israelites. But again, remember, there's a spiritual truth just underneath and behind these things. When it's time for God to deliver his people, chariots are nothing compared to the God who can speak light out of darkness and speak something out of nothing and bring about all the beauty of this earth. Chariots are nothing to a God who can come, send his one and only Son to conquer death and bring children home with him to glory. God is bigger than the chariots of men. So we keep that in mind. But that cycle is repeating itself. Israel abandons God. They cry out to God. God redeems them, and he sends a judge to deliver them. We're hearing that cycle over and over again, once again. It is interesting, though, in this story, when we get to the very end of the story, you'll notice in verse 23 of chapter 4, it says, on that day God subdued Jabin the Canaanite king before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, the Canaanite king, until they destroyed him. This is a different story than what we hear in the previous judges' stories. In the previous stories, the judge always comes, and what we have at the end of his story is, and that's when he killed the king and he rallied the people and they threw off their shackles forever. In this story, the oppression is broken, and yet it takes a little bit of time for the Israelites to free themselves. There's not the same swift, decisive blow in this story that we see in other judges' stories. Remember we talked about that spiral, that downward, outward spiral? The further we get into these chapters, the more we see that the people are getting further and further from who they ought to be and who God's calling them to be. And we see the echoes of that all throughout the story. And that's one thing I want to point out. We read how God delivers people. By the way, if you go on to continue to read the story, when the battle takes place, it's interesting that they choose a place for the battle. You'll notice that Deborah and Barak go to this specific location to meet Sisera and his armies. It's a place where chariots don't work so well. If you want to fight a chariot, would you rather do it on the hill country or in the wide open plains? Have you ever been to the prairies? We lived there for a number of years. Melody would fall asleep on our drive through Regina, and she'd wake up. And she'd have no idea how long she'd slept. Do you know why? Because it was the same grass outside the window for the first hour, the second hour, the third hour as we were driving. It's completely flat for so many of those miles. Actually, we live just outside the Capel Valley, and the Capel Valley is fascinating. It's a beautiful river-cut valley. The Capel River runs through the valley. But you drive up to it, and it's flat, and all of a sudden you drive down into it, and it's flat at the bottom. And then you drive up the other side, and it's flat again on the other side. It's like, it's flat on one side, it's flat at the bottom, it's flat on the side, and you just go, it's a remark, it's unique in my experience. We loved parts of our life out there. You know what can go really, really fast on the prairies? Vehicles. Absolutely. It terrifies me. It terrifies me to think about how many truckers must fall asleep driving the prairies every day. Because I know it happens. It's almost happened to me a few times, where you're just driving and driving and driving, and you're sort of like, I don't remember the last few miles. You can go fast. There's nothing to get in the way. My kids actually recently asked, can we move back to Saskatchewan? Teddy and Lily were both born in the Regina hospital. We had to drive an hour and a half to get to Regina to deliver our children, our younger two children. Thank goodness they took their time in getting here. But they wanted to move back to Saskatchewan because they can get their license at 15 instead of 16. Why not? There's nothing to hit. You just drive, right? And besides that, the farms are so big, if the kids are going to go take care of a field and it's, 2 sections away, you can't walk. You got to drive. So if you're going to fight a bunch of chariots, you're going to want to do it on the flat plains? Or you want to do it where every single foot is a bump on the road? Remember, iron chariots might have been cutting-edge technology. This is not a Bentley that cushions it's like driving on a cloud. This is an iron chariot. It sounds rugged and rough, doesn't it? Jolting, jostling. And as these Canaanites ride into battle, they realize very quickly the advantages of the chariots posed to them on the plains, they're no longer present here. And actually God sends environmental factors to further complicate it. Waters come, and actually some of them were actually washed away in the river. It's a remarkable story of God delivering his people. And there's so many details we can look at. In some ways I want to talk about Jael. In some ways I want to talk about this woman who destroys the commander. She brings him into her tent, which for in a nomadic people group, hospitality is such a high value and virtue. If you invite someone in, they become part of you're protecting them as if they were part of your own family. And she actually betrays Sisera. She ends up putting him to death. If you want to read a very graphic and in some ways very disturbing story, you can keep on doing that. It's an interesting and fascinating story. But God delivers his people through the hand of this woman who betrays her house guest. But I want to focus instead for this morning, when I think about us hearing clearly God's word in the story, can I focus on a moment of decision that we see in the story? And it comes as Deborah calls the man Barak to her. Deborah, who has been leading the people of Israel. We meet her sort of mid-story. She's a prophetess, it says in verse 4. She's leading Israel. She's judging Israel at that time. She holds court under a palm between Ramah and Bethel. And so she sends for this man, Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh. And she has a word from God for him. This is a prophetess, one who speaks for the Lord. And she says, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give you into his hands. Give him into your hands, That's the instruction. It's clear, it's direct, it has directions. Here's what you're going to do, here's where you're going to do it. God has said, now go. And I want to point out to you something that should be very encouraging for you as an individual today. Barak replies, if you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go. That sounds like me an awful lot of the time. When God gives me an instruction, I will say, all right, but I want to add conditions. I want to add stipulations. God, I'm willing to follow, but here is how far. Here are the terms. Let's go back to my parenting metaphor. Modern kids love this. What will I get if I do X? That's a question my kids ask, right? Isn't it? Have you ever heard this, right? Clean your room. Well, what can I have if I clean my room? Well, I suppose the quick answer is a clean room. I mean, that's the instruction, isn't it? Isn't that the question we ask as individuals? What will I get out of this? If you're asked something by society, if you're asked something in your workplace, isn't one of our questions or our motivations, what will I get out of it? Or if you're hesitant or if you're fearful, don't you want to hedge those bets? Don't you want to find some way in which you'll feel safe in the action? I think there's something very natural, very human about Barak's response. I'm willing to go, but it'd make me feel a lot better, Deborah, if you were standing there with me. You want to prove that the prophet believes that what they're speaking is from the Lord? If the prophet says you need to walk into the fire, if you want to prove that they believe what they're saying, okay, but you first. Right? Never trust someone who won't take their own medicine, who won't follow their own advice. Barak says, Deborah, I will go, but you better come with me. And that's a very human response. I don't think it's the right response. I don't think it's the right response. This is the word of encouragement I want you to hear this morning. God knows how weak you are. He knows how strong your faith is. He knows how big the monsters in your mind and your heart seem to you. And he will meet you where you are. I'm going to tell you a joke that my kids love. You have to be mature about this, okay? I'm taking your promise you're going to be mature about this. There's a preacher who was teaching. He's preaching from Psalm 100. Psalm 114. He's using the Old English translation. And he read for his congregation, for he knows our frame. He remembers that we are but dust. And a little boy in the corner started giggling and laughing. And his parents started elbowing him. Calm down. Wait, there's nothing funny. He said, Dad, didn't you hear him? He said we're butt dust. My kids love that joke. And that's why I don't read the Old English anymore, because they'll giggle their heads off when they hear it. The problem was that child missed the point of the verse. Let me read it for you again. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor anger forever. He does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion, hear that word. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. He knows who you are. He knows your weakness. He knows your frailty. Excuse me just 1 second, please. Excuse me. I'm going to try and power it out all the way to the end, but I don't think I'm going to make it if I keep going like that. Do you hear that? Your failure, your weakness, your frailty, it does not take God by surprise. He looks at you, he says, I know you, and I will be with you, and my grace in that moment will be enough for you. And so as we look at Deborah and Barak, God had every right to say to Deborah, you have given him your word, you have given him my word, now he needs to either follow or not, and I will choose another if he doesn't. But that's not our God, is it? Our God is a God of grace. God who knows his weakness, who knows our weakness. And there are consequences. Deborah says, because you've followed this path, the honor will go to another. But she says, I will go with you, Barak. Whatever God is asking you to do today, he will be with you in it. If you need his aid, he will be with you. If you need a person to walk through it with you, he will provide that individual. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why you need the church and the church needs you. Because there are people in here right now that are being asked something by God, and they are terrified by it, or they are fighting it. And maybe what they need this morning is a Deborah to walk alongside their Barak. Maybe you'll be the one who goes with them into that battle. Maybe you'll be the one who reaches out and say, I can't do this on my own. I need someone. Will you walk with me through this fire and flame and battle? You don't have to do it alone. But you do have to do it. Come to this big idea. The first and foundational step of faith must be obedience to God's clear call and command. I find preaching the gospel a little bit challenging, not because I don't know all the facts or the details. We had a preaching seminar here the other day. Do you realize I've preached probably more than 450 sermons from this pulpit? That's a lot of messages. That's more than I thought about. When I thought about it, that's a lot of me talking. Surprised some of you are still here, actually, now that I think about it. But the gospel still remains difficult for me to preach. I shouldn't say difficult for me to preach. I find preaching the gospel clearly can be a real challenge because there are two opposite sides to it. That if you miss one or you overemphasize the other, we've missed the gospel. And the one that I love to preach, and the one that many of us love to preach, and many of us start in this place, is with what God requires of you in order to be accepted by Him. And the answer is, He's already done what's required for you to be accepted. That's the good news of the gospel. We yesterday at our preaching seminars looked at 1 John 4, and I know you hear me say it all the time, but we're going to hear it again because it's right there on the black and white of the page. 1 John 4, 9 through 11 talks about God demonstrating. He puts His love on display by sending His one and only Son to us. This is love, it says, not that we love God, but that He loved us. His love began before your love. And if you are here and you want God to love you, you feel unloved, you desire, you long for someone to love you, let me give you the very good news. Someone has loved you, and He wants you, and He desires you for Himself. God made you to be His special treasure, and He has done everything that's required to make that happen. The reason Jesus came was to set you free from slavery. The reason Jesus lived His life. And we talk all the time about the cross of Jesus and the empty grave of Jesus. We don't often talk enough about the life of Jesus. Jesus lived the life He ought to have lived. Jesus lived the life you ought to have lived. And when you come to Jesus, He doesn't just take away your sin. He gives you everything you need to be a child of God. Freely. Fully, completely. It is yours, and all you have to do is receive it. God is not waiting for you to be good enough. He has made you good enough if you will accept it. That is the first half of the gospel. But if that is as far as we get, we have missed the fullness of the gospel. Because the other half of the gospel is Jesus says, "Come, follow me." You know the story about those fishermen at the side of the lake? You can find it in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 5 says, one day Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret with people crowding around Him, listening to the word of God. He sat at the water's edge, and there were two boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to push it out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for the catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked hard all night long. We haven't caught anything." By the way, as far as fishermen go, Peter was a terrible fisherman. Like every time I hear the guy, he's not catching anything. "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say it, I will let down the nets." Did you hear that? What was the only reason Peter let down the nets? "Jesus, you said it, I guess I'll give it a shot. I will do it." When they'd done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and they filled both boats that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Isn't that an interesting response? Jesus was seen clearly by Peter. Peter, in a moment, was given this clarity of vision. Not just of Jesus, but of himself. He realized who it had been that was in his boat and how unworthy he was to be in the same boat. Equally interesting is Jesus' response. Peter says, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. So were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Jesus' reply is, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So they pulled up their boats on shore and left everything they had, and what? They followed him. Jesus can fill your boat full of fish, but if you will not follow him, you've missed the power of the gospel. The first and foundational step of faith, it has to be obedience to God's clear call and command. What can we really expect? What is our expectation if God gives us clear instruction and we refuse to do it? And there may be many reasons to refuse. You may be terrified of what God's calling you to do or be. You may be terrified of what you have to say to your neighbor or your coworker or your spouse or your child or your friend. The thought of the implications of that interaction may terrify you. And that's what's keeping you from obedience. Maybe it's your comfort. How many of you are comfort-driven people? I bet if we measured our waistlines, I think we'd probably find some comfort-driven people. Please don't start with me. I would really appreciate it if we didn't start with me. How far will you go to avoid discomfort? Tell you what, let's go to our homes. How many devices in your home have one purpose? To avoid difficult labor. There's nothing wrong with those things until they become the idols of your home. Right? You know what I hate? When my dog has to use the bathroom at 2 a.m. Do you know why I hate that? Because I got to get up, I got to get dressed, I got to go outside, even if it's 20 below, I got to help the dog go to the bathroom. But you know what? Sometimes that's the cost of dog ownership. You know what good dog owners do when their dog needs to go to the bathroom at 2 a.m.? They get up, they get dressed, they go outside. And if comfort becomes your idol, you will choose and do things which are detrimental to yourself and detrimental to others. They will destroy you. Sometimes the things that keep us from doing what we ought to do and being what we ought to be is this comfort, this divot. Any of you have a couch at home that's so familiar with your shape that it's taken form to your shape? I don't think that's memory foam, but sometimes the foam has memory. And sometimes it takes a little bit of rocking to get you out of that spot. Maybe it's comfort that's keeping you from where you ought to be. Whatever it is, you cannot see the blessing of God in your life until that step of obedience is taken. And as we hear this story from the book of Judges this morning, as you think about this, I want you to hear it clearly. What's the next step? I don't want you to think 10 steps down the road. Some of you are going to be called to remarkable things. Maybe you'll start a cancer care and recovery ministry where you go into the places where people are struggling with these life-altering situations. Not only the disease, but the cure for that disease or the treatment for that disease. It can devastate life. Maybe some of you will be called to a ministry like that. Maybe some of you will give everything you have to help liberate people in trouble and difficulty. Maybe some of you will devote yourselves to the care of the most forgotten people in our society. There may be huge things on the horizon for us. Some of us may change the face of our communities. I have no doubt that God can and will do that through our church family. But I'm not talking about that right now. What I'm asking you this morning is, what is the next step of obedience? Because you will never get to those big things. We will never see God operating in the big things, the great things, the grand things, if we can't take the first step of obedience. I sometimes struggle with some simple things of faith. Some simple, straightforward stuff. And when I look at it and I read and I think about it, I realize what's at the heart of that battle is a clear instruction from God. This is what I have for you. Now follow me. And I can't tell you what that is for you this morning. I'm not going to point at you one by one and say, here's your next step. I may speak from the pulpit, but I'm no prophet like Deborah. I didn't call you here because I can tell you the name of the valley and the number of the men and the battle strategy you should employ today. What I am here to tell you this morning is that God has a plan for your life, and He's a purpose for your life, and He's made very clear statements about who you're supposed to be and what it means to follow Him. And what I will say to you with absolute certainty is blessing lies down that path. Do not let fear or discomfort or an inability to see the future. Don't let any of those things cloud your path. Don't let the lies of the enemy cloud your judgment. Follow Him, and we will see God's glory as we walk together after Him. That is the promise. Deborah and Barak, as they went and they fought, they watched as the iron chariots brought no victory, but only defeat. They watched as the iron chariots turned and fled from God's people. And they discovered that the greatest commander of his day lay dead in a tent. There was no grand battlefield. There was no riding off into the sunset. He died betrayed by someone he trusted, far from the battlefield, fleeing for his life. The Lord brings victory. He brings victory. And nothing in the world can touch those who He calls by His name. Let's follow Him.